Hi, welcome to our class. I hope that you're having a great Omer or had a great Omer, and that we will arrive in Yitz Hashem V'imla Mashiach Yavo together at Sinai on the 6th of Sivan. Our talk for this Tikkun Leil Shavuot is a little bit different. It's not exactly an ancient talk about ancient texts, but I'd like to spend a few moments with you on the subject of automotive Israel. We don't generally think of Israel as an automotive giant or a giant of any other kind, but in fact there has been, there is, and there will continue to be a significant automotive and automotive-related industry in Israel. It's not easy to get statistics on the automotive industry, as you will learn in a few moments, in Israel, but we can say that in spite of the fact that Israelis are not generally as addicted to motor cars as Americans are, that 12% of the Israeli government's income is in fact related to the automotive industry, particularly in the taxes on sales from cars. And that's where we begin. There are two sources that you may want to check. One of them, on the left of your screen, is called Totaled. It's a book that was published about a year ago by Brian Blum, and that is a book about the Better Place, Shai Agassi's attempt to manufacture battery-powered cars in Israel. We will come back to that later on in the talk. And on the right is a film that came out a couple of years ago called Desert Tested, and it is about the Autocars Limited of Haifa, or of the Haifa area, and the company that we will talk about in a few moments. Those of us who are old enough and were in Israel early enough may remember the cars that were produced. But first, let's take a look at something that is really unusual, and today for automobile collectors is a prized item. There are very few left, and we start out by looking at the escutcheon for this automobile, which, as you can see, is stated in English as well as depicted a sabra. And of course, a sabra, as we all know, is a kind of cactus, prickly on the outside, sweet on the inside, that denotes a native-born Israeli. And this name was used, and this emblem was used on a sports car that was manufactured from the early to the middle 60s in Israel, and this car manufactured, as you can see, by Autocars Limited. Here, Haifa, they actually then moved to Tirat Carmel, which is a suburb of Haifa, and this is the Sabra sports car. It was based on the English model Ashley GT, and it carried a 1,000 cc cubic centimeter engine, and as you can see, it was a sporty looking car. Here is a yellow version of the same one, the same automobile, and an interior picture of the Sabra as it was built for the Israeli and a couple of other markets. In 1961, the Autocars Limited Company of Haifa shipped a car to the United States, shipped a Sabra to the United States for the New York Auto Show. Unfortunately, the car literally fell apart en route and never made it to the show. Autocars was hoping that that would launch the sales of an Israeli sports car in the United States. In 1963, a Sabra, this car, and here is a picture of the engine compartment, was entered in the Sebring automobile races. Unfortunately, the drive shaft fell apart during the race and the car never finished the race. Here is a white version of the car that is shown in a showroom in Israel, and as you can see, it's only a 6-figure license plate, and in Israel, 5- and 6-figure license plates are remembered as old license plates. The classic cars often had only 5- or 6-figure license plates. Autocars Limited was founded by an immigrant, a Polish immigrant to Israel by the name of Yitzchak Shubinsky. Shubinsky was an interesting character. He moved to Israel, he was a merchant, and he had the idea that he could start an automotive industry in Israel. In fact, the company, which lasted until the early 1980s, which was called Autocars, as we know, lasted for a while. Shubinsky was very well politically connected, and he kept the car company going by contracts with the government and with the army. And those of us who were in Israel in the 1980s or shortly afterwards will remember the pictures will remember the car. You'll see it in the pictures that was used for the post office, the Doar in Israel, and was also used by army officers. And here's a commercial version of it's labeled the Sabra, and again a product of Autocars, and that's pretty much what the civilian passenger non-commercial market looked like. And here we have a picture of the plant, the factory scene of Autocars, and you can see in the forefront the sports car, the Sabra, and to the right and in the rear of the picture you see the more popular and common car that was known as a susita, a play off the Hebrew word sus, which of course means a horse. And here are the cars in a showroom in Israel, and here is an advertising ad for the car. Please note the shape of that car. We're going to talk a little bit more about the origins of the car as well. And here is the commercial version, the one that many of us may have seen. There's a little pickup truck on your right, and on the left, if you look closely, you'll see that the symbol on the front passenger door of that car is the Doar, is the Israeli post office. And so these were commercial vehicles. And again, Shubinsky kept the company going by politics, and these cars were purchased by the IDF and assigned to officers. So some of us are old enough to remember seeing them. These cars were built on the Reliant. The Reliant was a British automobile, and as you can see, it was a three-wheeler. Unlike the cars that were built in California, the one wheel was in front, the other two wheels in the back. And this was one of the cars that Shubinsky based the Israeli car on. It used a 1700cc motor, which was a British motor that was made by Ford. Reliant was the Ford company that operated in the UK. And Shubinsky developed a four-wheel car that was based on the Reliant and based on the Reliant's drivetrain. Another car that we based on, and this one you should see the familiarity between this and the picture of the car that we saw in the ad with the model. This was the Ford Anglia, which was also a British Ford version, much of which was borrowed by Autocars of Haifa, and including the engine. And here we see a 1951 Ford Anglia engine. The other company that Autocars based its cars on was the Hino. And in this case, it's the Hino Contessa, and you'll notice that it says that this was assembled by Autocars in Haifa. Many of us don't remember the Hino Japanese car company. It no longer exists. The Hino company existed from 1953, post-World War II, to 1967. In 1967, the Hino company dissolved. Its passenger car division became part of Toyota, but its commercial vehicle and its truck company became what we now know as Isuzu, and that company still exists, and we see Isuzu trucks around the States. And this is the precursor. This was the Hino Contessa. And as it says, assembled by Autocars, the Hino was assembled in Israel. It was what we call CKD manufacturing. CKD stands for complete knockdown. What would happen, and still happens today in the automotive industry around the world, is that because of tariffs or other regulations, automobiles would be built, or their parts, their components would be built, perhaps disassembled or never assembled, shipped to the destination country, in this case to Haifa, shipped to the destination port in parts and assembled in Israel. So you couldn't claim that the Hino Contessa was built in Israel, but it was in fact assembled in Israel, and a good deal of Autocars Limited's business had to do with CKD manufacturing, complete knockdown. You receive the car in freights, in parts, and then you put the cars together. Another car that was assembled this way in Israel was, if you read the Triumph, hold on one second, I'm going to ask, our computer had a little reminder for me, sorry about that. And if you're reading your Hebrew, that is a Triumph car. Triumph is familiar to North Americans, mostly as sports cars, but there was a Triumph manufacturer of passenger cars, of family vehicles, and as you can see, it says Mish Yishaveh, what is equal to a Triumph, this being a Triumph 1500, referring again to the cc's of the engine, a 1969 version. Sorry that ad is not as clear as we would like it to be. But let's go now to today's automotive industry in Israel, or related to Israel. And here we have an example of an automotive industries plant. Automotive Industries, which is a big company, does not actually manufacture vehicles, except they manufacture the armor for vehicles and specialize in vehicle armoring and in conversion of vehicles for armored use. The picture that you are looking at is a picture of an assembly line, and you can see the armor, the space for the turret on top of what was going to be an armored vehicle. This is Israel Automotive Limited's factory, except this is actually a factory that is Israeli-owned and operated in Ethiopia, and in fact, this factory in Ethiopia operates under an Israeli license. The finished product looks a lot more like this, and those of you who are familiar can see the relationship to the American product, the Jeep, except this is armored. AIL, Automotive Industries Limited, is one of the companies that today in Israel functions for this purpose, making armored vehicles in Israel and around the world. Gaia Automotive Industries is another of the armoring and conversion companies that exists and functions in Israel today. One of the most interesting of those companies is Plasan. Plasan is owned by Kibbutz Sasa, which is still an old-fashioned collective model of the kibbutz, and Plasan makes a wide variety of armor for vehicles and conversions. On the right, you can see a large vehicle armored with track capability for going in snow or sand, and the little thing that you see on the left is actually an armored golf cart. And if you look at Plasan, you can see all kinds of things. They even make armor for motorcycles as well as for four-wheeled vehicles. That is going on today. In the past, but in the very recent past, many of you may be familiar with A Better Place. A Better Place, which I referred to, the book that you saw at the beginning, A Total Crash, I believe it was called. That book was Better Place was started in 2008 by an entrepreneur by the name of Shai Agassi. Unfortunately, the company went bankrupt in 2013 due to mismanagement, as most people say. What you have in front of you is a picture of Better Place's installation, which was near the airport in Tel Aviv. These were electrical cars with a battery, and of course we're talking about almost 20 years ago, and the idea was that the battery would be replaced, that you would not sit and wait for the car to recharge, but after driving a certain amount, you would go into a place that looked like this, and the machinery would in fact move under the car. And these are pictures from A Better Place, the demo, as you saw, I'm going to go back for 1 second. Agassi, A Better Place, made the cars by converting Renault Lagunas, and some of us, including myself, were actually there in Tel Aviv and had the opportunity to drive these cars. The idea here, once again, is that you drove into an installation that looked like this. Automatically, the machinery would unhitch the battery from the bottom of your car, bring up a charged battery, and replace it. And this is from the demo place in Tel Aviv, where you could watch that process taking place, both above ground and underground. Unfortunately, as I said, the company was mismanaged and didn't quite make it, because if you had charging places, and there were about 20 of them in Israel, that was close enough that you could travel from one end of the country to the other without having to recharge. The idea of a changeable battery on an electrically powered car is not exactly a new idea. In fact, it was introduced in Hartford, Connecticut in the 1890s, where the Hartford Electric Company, as well as another company called Milburn Lighting in Chicago, had designed electric cars back at the end of the 19th century based on the idea that you would exchange batteries en route. Unfortunately, a better place didn't make it, and this is a abandoned battery changing facility somewhere in Israel, and the red sign says for sale. So if you want an old battery exchange place, you could use that in Israel. However, the failure of a better place hardly means the end of Israel's involvement in high-tech automobiles. In fact, today, GM has a large presence in Israel. GM Ventures, their investment branch also. The Volkswagen Company, which is probably the largest, if not close to the largest, automobile manufacturer in the world today, has installations in Israel that deal with a number of brands, research for a number of brands, including Audi, which you're familiar with here in Cleveland, Seat, which is a Spanish car, Skoda, which is a wonderful car. Many of the taxis in Israel are now Skodas. That's a Czech Republic car, unfortunately not yet imported to the United States. Porsche, Bentley, Bugatti, and Lamborghini, a few of the more familiar names. BMW and Mercedes-Daimler are also involved in doing R&D research in Israel. There is also a significant presence of Geely, which is the Chinese company, which owns Volvo, as well as Polestar, which is commercial, perhaps not as familiar, as well as Tata, the Indian company, which currently owns the former British brands Jaguar and Land Rover. And now we can look a bit to the future. Many of us now in America are familiar with Waze. We have Waze on our cell phones, and that's how we get from place to place. We know when the traffic's coming up. We rely on Waze to get us around accidents and traffic jams, and also to tell us where the cops are hiding out. Waze started out as an Israeli product, was purchased in 2013 by Google for $1.2 billion, that's with a B, $billion. Mobileye, which, full disclosure, is a company that my daughter-in-law used to work for. Mobileye, which makes the computerization of the visualizing systems, the systems that allow your car to tell you how close you are to the car in front of you, or helps your car to park by itself. Also an Israeli startup company that was acquired by Intel in 2017 for $15.33 billion. And so while Israel is not manufacturing either from the ground up, borrowed, or knocked down assembly of cars, Israel is still very, very much involved in the world automotive industry, perhaps more so than ever before. And part of that explanation is Israel is in the forefront, including by a company called StoreDot, which is in the process of developing batteries that charge faster, last longer, which we know is one of the major limitations on EVs, on automotive vehicles, as well as Mobileye. This is Mobileye's plant, which is working now, again, part of Intel, to develop this kind of a car, which is not only electric, but is also completely self-driving, a totally autonomous vehicle. And so a little bit of an introduction to automotive Israel, an interesting past, although not always successful past, a very important presence in Israel today at this time, and great hopes about Israel not necessarily becoming a place where cars are manufactured, but certainly a country which is making an enormous contribution to today and the future's automotive industry globally, worldwide. And so I wish you a wonderful Shavuot. Thank you for joining us. I hope you found our talk interesting and that you'll take time to learn a little bit more about automotive Israel. Chag Sameach.